Welcome to the first session of a second ReConnect China MOOC series. The second ReConnect China MOOC series deals with relations between the European Union and China. My name is Bart Dessein, and I am a senior full professor at Ghent University in Belgium. What I will do in this first session is giving a short overview of the historical events, important historical events that have shaped Chinese-European relations and that were the basis of the current relations that exist between the European Union and China. And I will start this overview of major historical events with giving some reflections on the Great Wall of China, about its functioning as border and as limit. Now, the Great Wall of China was built in the 3rd century before the Common Era. And actually, it is the combination of already existing walls that had to protect agricultural areas of China. And this shows that the wall was meant as a limit which is different from a border. A border is something you can go beyond or across border places. A limit has to stop, has to prevent contact. And this was indeed the case. To the north of the Chinese agricultural land, there was living nomadic people, and there was the fear that these nomadic people would invade the agricultural lands of China, and that is why the wall was built. And the wall was built, as you can see in this quotation, following the terrain, the natural terrain of the Chinese landscape. And this is very famously to be seen here at the wall to the north of Beijing, where you can really see that the wall is following the mountainous terrain. If you go to the westernmost part of the wall, you end up at Jiayuan in Gansu province. And so this is a fort, and the wall ends in a fort. And beyond the fort, there is the Taklamakan Desert, which is a natural boundary. So no external threat was perceived to be able to cross the Taklamakan Desert into the Chinese heartland. And if you go to the easternmost part of the wall, then you see that the wall ends in a kind of a small fort that enters the sea, showing that indeed at that moment there was no maritime threat for the Chinese cultural and agricultural land, and there was a threat terrestrial coming from the north from the nomadic people. It's also interesting to note that in Chinese historiography, the Great Wall of China has always been described and perceived as a negative symbol. Negative, one reason because it was built by forced labor and was maintained by forced labor, but in the context of today's presentation, even more important, it was conceived negatively because it was a limit. It was something that had a building that had to prevent intercultural contact. The wall did not serve its function. The nomadic peoples by time did cross the mountainous landscape up to the wall and went beyond the wall, invading the Chinese cultural heartland. And this explains why in the 2nd imperial dynasty, the very famous Han dynasty, that the emperor sent an envoy by name of Zhang Qian to go to Central Asia to look for a military ally so as to be able to better protect the Chinese heartland to prevent the nomadic people from entering China. Now, militarily, this was not a success. The people of Central Asia were not willing to join China in a military alliance. But the importance of it, again, in function of the topic of today, is that through this envoy and to this mission to Central Asia, the Chinese people came to know about the local produce, about the arts and the handicrafts of the Central Asian region. And this started actually what then became known as the Silk Road. And the Silk Road term which was only coined in the 19th century, but since the Han Dynasty, so since the beginning, let's say, of the Common Era, we see that there was a cultural and at first a trade and economic connection between China and Central Asia, but with that also came culture. Some important elements of this cultural exchange are to be situated in the religious context, with the entry of Buddhism in China in the beginning of the Common Era, also already in the 7th century, the entry of Islam. And this brings me to a second major period in cultural period in the Chinese history, that is the Tang Dynasty, which I have labeled here a cosmopolitan period. Cosmopolitan from a Confucian perspective. That is to say that through cultural exchange, through economic exchange with people outside of the Chinese heartland, there was a general development of or a spread of Chinese culture to these other areas. The Chinese people came into contact with other people, and we, in this sense, have a kind of an integration of different cultures to in the Chinese in China. And this is, for instance, to be seen with Islam. Here we have an Islamic graveyard in Fujian province. Fujian province, that is the east coast of China. So it really shows that Islam, or in the 7th century, had become a very important religion in China. And this was interpreted in a very Confucian way. And here I have some quotations of one of the emperors of the Tang Dynasty, Emperor Taizong, who said that he, as son of heaven, which is a denomination of the Emperor of China, so that he, as son of heaven of the great Tang Dynasty, would take care of the affairs of the heavenly Khan. With this, he refers to the people of Central Asia. And he also says in the second quotation that he would, or that the people of Central Asia were looking at him, were seeing him as if he were their parent. Again, a very Confucian interpretation of history and of intercultural contact. China, the Chinese emperor, as a kind of the preserver of a harmonious order between China and the lands in the periphery of China, of Chinese culture. The Yuan dynasty, that is the dynasty when China was part of the Great Mongolian Empire, is another breakthrough or another important milestone in Chinese-European contacts, as it is for the first time in that period that there is a direct contact between Europeans and Chinese. This is, for instance, to be seen in the accounts of Willem von Rubroek, who was a friar, and who worked in the service, let's say, of the Khan, and the Khan in this respect referring to the Mongol emperor. And also it is the time of Marco Polo, who in his famous Le Divisement du Monde, the description of the world, writes about China as he allegedly saw it. I say allegedly because there's still an academic discussion whether indeed Marco Polo himself was in China in the Mongol period, or whether he had his knowledge about China from his father and uncle. Be that as it may, it is a witness of direct presence of Europeans in China. Another following great Chinese dynasty is the Ming dynasty. And this is the dynasty in which, as I put it here, China really discovers the world beyond the seas. in two respects. One respect is the entry of Jesuit missionaries in China, most famous one, most likely being Matteo Ricci. Matteo Ricci, who entered China through Macau, and who, together with the fellow Jesuit priests, introduced Western science in China, very famously cartography. Also, the other way around, it is the way or the period in which the Chinese directly discovered the world outside the seas. That is epitomized, let's say, in the 7 voyages the eunuch Zheng undertook in the early 15th century, voyages that brought him to the east coast of Africa. Also in this period, very similar to what we have seen in for the Tang dynasty, is that also these contacts with the world outside or beyond the seas was perceived, was interpreted in a Confucian way. And the following quotations testify of this. Jin Youzi wrote a poem upon the return of one of these voyages that went to Africa, back to China, a voyage that brought along a giraffe as a present to the Chinese emperor, a giraffe that was likened to a unicorn, which is then a very famous, very important animal in Chinese mythology. And so the very fact that the African people presented a giraffe as a present for the emperor was seen as, once again, a sign of appreciation of the African people vis-a-vis the Chinese emperor. And so once again, it was a kind of a Confucian interpretation as the emperor that is being recognized as the person who is able to maintain a harmonious world outside in China and also into the outside world. When we come to the last imperial dynasty, which is the Qing dynasty, which was ruled by the Manchus, so the Manchus was the Qing dynasty was a Manchu dynasty, we see yet another aspect of European-Chinese relations, this time related to the first industrial revolution in Europe, with which came the colonial period and which brought also Europe and European warships to China in the very famous Opium War, a period in which the Chinese traditional perception of the Confucian way of looking at the world was put to the question, resulting in it that the Chinese intellectuals started to reinterpret their Confucian tradition, were open for European ideologies, European science, as I mentioned, first brought in through the Jesuits. So all this was seen in a new perspective, and a new perspective that was, of course, based on the fact or directly related to the fact that China had entered a new phase of globalization, and the globalization of the 19th century. It is also very interesting to see how in this period China is also appreciated very much in at least some circles of Western Europe for its secular model. I have mentioned the Jesuits, who saw in China, of course, an area for conversion. So from a religious perspective, but also in the secular context, we see that China was in this period very much appreciated. You can see this here in this quotation of a work of Voltaire. Also interesting is that this appreciation for the secular society of China resulted in an appreciation of the Great Wall of China. And it is, interestingly, also in this very period that also the perception of the Great Wall in China changes from being associated with negative feelings towards a more positive appreciation, precisely because also Western Europe is thinking positively of the great structure that is the Great Wall. And this brings us then to the globalization of the 21st century, in which we see that all types of dynamisms are interacting. We have constant changes in economic dynamics, political dynamics, ideological dynamics between Europe and China. And this is then, of course, leading to the formulation of EU policies towards contemporary China. How this in practice looks like and functions, this will be discussed by my colleagues in the following sessions in this second MOOC series on EU-China relations. I thank you for your attention.